Hello and welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, you don't need to think about where you've been or what tomorrow might ask of you. All you need to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the world slow down for a while. In this series, Sleepy Journeys, we'll be traveling together, sometimes to real places, deep forests, quiet rivers, forgotten paths, sometimes to places that couldn't possibly exist, but feel calm enough that they probably should. There's no rush, no danger, and no destination we need to reach. The journey itself is enough. Before you get cozy, though, take just a moment to gently support the channel. If you enjoy these quiet stories, consider liking the video and subscribing, so other sleepy souls wandering the internet late at night can find their way here too. You can also leave a comment with where you're listening from. It's comforting to know we're all resting together, even from far away. Now, find a position that feels easy. Let your breathing soften. There's nothing you need to follow closely, and nothing important you might miss. When you're ready, we'll begin our journey. Slowly, calmly, and one peaceful step at a time. In the early years of the 16th century, the world known to Europe still felt incomplete. Maps ended abruptly. Coastlines faded into blank parchment. Beyond those edges lived uncertainty, rumor, and the quiet fear of distance. Sailors spoke of seas that stretched too far to cross, of winds that never returned, of waters where ships slowly vanished without sound. Yet the world was already connected by desire. Spices, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon traveled across continents and oceans before reaching European tables. They passed through many hands, many ports, many taxes. By the time they arrived, they were worth more than gold. Control of these routes meant power, wealth, and influence over kingdoms. Portugal held the eastern path. Its ships sailed around Africa, guarding the route to the Indies. Spain, bound by treaties and rivalry, searched for another way. A western path, a passage across unknown seas. This was the world Ferdinand Magellan lived in. He was born in Portugal, trained for the sea from a young age, and shaped by years of service along distant coasts. He had seen India. He had known hardship, heat, hunger, and discipline. He believed, as many navigators did, that the earth could be circled by water alone, that Asia could be reached by sailing west. But belief did not always earn favor. Magellan returned to Portugal with plans and petitions. He asked for ships, he asked for recognition, he asked for trust. Each request was refused. His ideas were considered impractical. His loyalty was questioned. Eventually, he turned away from his homeland. He crossed into Spain quietly. There, he presented his proposal again. A westward voyage. A passage through or around the lands newly encountered across the Atlantic. A route to the Spice Islands that would belong to Spain, not Portugal. The Spanish crown listened. King Charles I approved the venture. Preparations began slowly. 5 ships were gathered. They were not new. They were not large. They were working vessels built for trade and exploration rather than comfort. Their names were Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago. They were constructed of oak and pine, their hulls sealed with pitch and tar. Their decks creaked even at anchor. Below deck, space was limited. Supplies were stacked tightly. Barrels were wedged into every corner. Each ship carried sails of heavy canvas, ropes thick with hemp, and anchors that strained their chains. Iron was precious. Every nail, every tool, every fitting mattered. The crews were assembled from many places. Most were Spanish. Some were Portuguese. Others came from Italy, France, Germany, and the Low Countries. Many were sailors by trade. Others were soldiers, carpenters, priests, or servants. Few had sailed together before. They numbered around 270 men. Life aboard would not be equal. Officers slept in slightly better conditions. Common sailors slept where space allowed. Some lay on deck beneath the open sky. Others slept below, among barrels and cargo, breathing air thick with dampness and smoke. Food was loaded in bulk. Hardtack dry biscuits, baked until nearly indestructible, formed the foundation of every meal. Salted beef and pork were packed in barrels. Dried fish, cheese, legumes, olive oil, vinegar, and wine filled the remaining space. Fresh water was limited. It would grow stale quickly. No one expected comfort. Clothing was simple and layered. Wool tunics, linen shirts, heavy cloaks. Sailors owned few changes of garments. Once wet, clothes might stay damp for days. Cold and heat were endured rather than avoided. Navigation instruments were gathered carefully. Compasses, astrolabes, quadrants, charts copied by hand. Knowledge passed from experience rather than certainty. Longitude could not be measured accurately. Distance would be estimated by speed, time, and intuition. Prayer was part of preparation. Before departure, confessions were heard. Blessings were spoken. Families said their goodbyes without knowing if they would meet again. Many would not. On the morning of departure, the harbor was quiet. The ships lay low in the water, heavy with supplies. Ropes were checked. Sails were inspected. Orders were given calmly, deliberately. On the 20th day of September, in the year 1519, the fleet left the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Oars guided them at first, easing the ships into open water. The river widened. The land slowly fell behind. As the coastline faded, routines began. Sails were adjusted. Watches were set. Bells marked the passing hours. Men learned the rhythm of the ship, the way it rolled, the way it groaned, the way it responded to wind. At night, the stars returned. They were brighter away from land. They offered guidance and comfort. Sailors watched them carefully, memorizing patterns, trusting their steady presence. Below deck, men lay close to one another for warmth. Bodies shared heat. Breath condensed in the cold air. Sleep came in fragments. The voyage had begun. No one aboard could yet imagine the full distance ahead. No one could measure the costs that would be paid, slowly, day by day. For now, there was only motion. The ships moved westward. The sea accepted them without resistance, and the world, still largely unknown, waited in silence. Once the coastline of Europe had disappeared, the voyage became quieter. Not silent, but steady. The ships moved with the wind, their sails drawing full during the day and easing at night. The ocean surface changed constantly. At times it was smooth and reflective, broken only by the ship's wake. At other times it rose and fell in long, slow swells that lifted the hulls gently, as if breathing. Daily life settled into rhythm. Each ship followed the same structure. The day was divided by watches. Bells were struck to mark the passing hours. Sailors rotated between duty and rest, though true rest was rare. Even when off watch, men remained alert, ready to respond to commands or sudden changes in weather. Most tasks were repetitive. Sails were adjusted to catch shifting winds. Ropes were coiled and recoiled. Decks were scraped clean of salt and grime. Water was pumped from the bilge by hand. The ship was never still, and neither were the men who served it. Below deck, conditions were difficult. Light was limited. Air circulated poorly. Smoke from cooking fires clung to the wooden beams. Moisture seeped into everything. Barrels swelled and creaked. Clothing never fully dried. Sleep came where it could. Some men slept on rough mats. Others rested directly on the planks. When weather allowed, sailors preferred to sleep on deck beneath the open sky, wrapped in cloaks, listening to the wind and the rigging. At sea, the night sky felt close, almost protective. Food was distributed carefully. Meals were simple and regular. Hardtack was soaked in water or wine to soften it. Salted meat was boiled to reduce its harshness. When the meat was too old or too tough, it was eaten anyway. Hunger made few demands. Water was rationed from the beginning. Fresh water was stored in wooden casks that quickly grew stale. Vinegar was often mixed with it to slow spoilage. Wine was consumed daily, diluted when necessary. Thirst was tolerated quietly. Each ship carried a small cooking area, usually a brick-lined hearth set low to prevent fire from spreading. Meals were prepared in large pots. Smoke drifted across the deck and disappeared into the wind. Navigation was constant. During daylight, officers measured the height of the sun using astrolabes or quadrants. At night, they watched the stars. Speed was estimated by watching floating objects pass the hull, counting time, and trusting experience. There was no certainty. Charts offered guidance but not reassurance. Coastlines were drawn from rumor and memory. Distances were guessed. Errors were expected. Despite this, discipline remained firm. Magellan ruled the fleet with authority. Orders were delivered clearly. Obedience was enforced. Disagreements were noted but not encouraged. The chain of command mattered more at sea than anywhere else. Tensions existed beneath the surface. Some Spanish captains resented taking orders from a Portuguese commander. Pride traveled with the ships. So did suspicion. But open conflict was postponed by the shared demands of the voyage. Storms appeared without warning. Dark clouds gathered. Winds shifted sharply. Sails were reefed quickly. Ropes strained. The ships pitched and rolled, taking water over the sides. Men clung to rigging, soaked and cold, their hands raw from rope and salt. When storms passed, damage was assessed quietly. Canvas was repaired with needle and thread. Ropes were replaced when possible. Broken fittings were secured with care. Every repair mattered. Replacement materials were limited. Between storms, long stretches of calm returned. The ocean flattened. The wind softened. Progress slowed. The ships drifted, their sails hanging loose. These days tested patience more than fear. Men talked during these hours. They spoke of home, of families left behind, of previous voyages, of imagined lands across the sea. Stories passed the time and eased the distance. At night, prayers were said. Some were spoken aloud. Others were whispered privately. Faith traveled with every sailor, shaped by fear, hope, and habit. Weeks passed. The sun rose and fell. The horizon remained unchanged. The ships continued westward, cutting steadily through open water. South America lay ahead, though no one yet knew how far. For now, there was only the sea, the wind, and the slow accumulation of days. And beneath the routine, unseen but growing, the strain of uncertainty followed them onward. The first sight of land did not arrive suddenly. It emerged as a dark line on the horizon, low and uncertain, easily mistaken for cloud or shadow. Only after hours of watching did its shape hold steady. The ocean changed color. Birds appeared. The smell of earth carried faintly across the water. South America lay before them. The ships approached the coast cautiously. Sails were adjusted. Anchors were prepared. After weeks of open sea, the presence of land brought relief, but also tension. Coasts were unknown. Currents were unpredictable. Shallows waited unseen. They anchored and went ashore in stages. Fresh water was gathered from rivers and streams. Barrels were refilled carefully. Wood was cut for repairs and fuel. Fresh food, when available, was taken aboard. Fish were caught. Small animals were hunted when possible. The difference was immediate. Fresh water eased thirst. Fresh food revived strength. Morale lifted briefly, carried by the simple comfort of solid ground beneath the feet. The coast was explored slowly. Small boats were lowered. Crews surveyed inlets and river mouths. Every opening was examined with care. The purpose was clear. Somewhere along this coast, a passage to the west must exist. Days turned into weeks. The coastline stretched endlessly. Rivers widened and narrowed. Forests pressed close to the shore. The land offered no clear opening. Progress felt slow. Patience wore thin. Winter approached. As the fleet moved south, temperatures dropped. Winds grew harsher. Nights became longer. Clothing that had once been adequate now felt insufficient. Dampness settled into bones. The decision was made to winter along the coast. Shelter was constructed on land when possible. Tents and simple huts were raised. Fires burned constantly. Ships were secured as best they could against storms. It was during this enforced stillness that divisions deepened. The long months without movement magnified resentment. Some captains questioned Magellan's authority openly. Supplies were dwindling faster than expected. The promised passage had not been found. Voices rose during meetings. Orders were obeyed, but reluctantly. Loyalty frayed. Whispers spread through the camps and across the decks. Magellan remained firm, responding with discipline rather than persuasion. Mutiny followed. Several officers attempted to seize control of the expedition. Their plan was discovered. Confrontation was swift. Punishments were severe. One leader was executed. Others were marooned along the coast, left behind with limited provisions. Their fate was uncertain and likely brief. The message was clear. Order would be maintained at any cost. The ships endured the winter together. Cold winds battered their hulls. Ice formed along the edges of the shore. Snow fell intermittently. Work continued despite numb hands and stiff joints. Rigging was checked. Sails were folded and refolded. Hulls were inspected for damage. Food grew scarcer. Rations were reduced. Fresh supplies became rare. Hunger settled in quietly. Men learned to eat slowly, to stretch each meal. Despite hardship, the fleet survived the season. When the worst of the winter passed, preparations resumed. The ships were readied once more. The search would continue. One vessel, sent ahead to explore, was lost to storms. Its crew survived, but the ship did not. This loss weighed heavily. It was a reminder of how easily progress could be erased. With fewer ships and fewer men, the expedition moved forward. The coast still offered no clear passage. But the belief remained. Somewhere ahead, the land would open. The sea would lead them west. And so the fleet pressed on, leaving behind the silent remains of winter camps and unresolved tensions, carrying with them both determination and doubt. When the fleet resumed its southward course, the coastline felt harsher than before. The land rose in uneven shapes, rocky and exposed. Winds swept down from higher latitudes, colder and more persistent. The sea no longer felt welcoming. Waves struck the hulls with greater force, sending spray across the decks and soaking anyone on watch. Sailing became more difficult. The ships hugged the coast, careful not to drift too far into open water. Currents pulled unpredictably. Fog rolled in without warning, blurring the line between sea and land. At times, visibility dropped so low that ships could barely see one another. Signals were exchanged constantly. Flags were raised and lowered. Horns were sounded when necessary. Lanterns burned at night to keep the fleet together. Separation in these waters could be fatal. Daily work continued despite the conditions. Sails were reefed and unreefed repeatedly. Ropes stiffened in the cold. Hands cracked and bled. Sailors wrapped cloth around their palms to protect the skin, but the salt water found every opening. Below deck, dampness worsened. Water seeped through seams. Condensation dripped from beams. Bedding remained wet for days at a time. The smell of mold and rot grew stronger. Rats thrived in the darkness, feeding on spilled grain and scraps. Men grew thinner. Rations were reduced again. Salted meat was often spoiled, its surface slick and foul. It was scraped clean and eaten regardless. Hardtack crawled with insects. Sailors knocked it against the deck before eating, loosening what lived inside. Fresh water became precious once more. Casks leaked. Some water turned sour. Vinegar was added, masking taste but not thirst. Each cup was measured carefully. No one drank more than allowed. Despite hardship, the search continued. Every inlet was examined. Narrow passages were entered cautiously, then abandoned when they led nowhere. Crews went ashore when possible, scanning the land for signs of an opening. Each failure weighed heavily. Morale shifted. Hope no longer surged. It lingered quietly, fragile and restrained. Men followed orders out of necessity rather than optimism. The voyage had already demanded too much to be abandoned easily. At night, the cold deepened. Sailors slept close together, sharing warmth. Cloaks were pulled tight. Breath rose in pale clouds. Dreams, when they came, were often restless. The ships themselves showed strain. Wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes. Seams loosened. Repairs were constant. Tar was heated and reapplied. Nails were driven back into place. Every effort was made to keep the hull sound. The ocean tested them relentlessly. Storms struck with little warning. Waves slammed against the sides. Water poured over the decks. Men clung to rigging, their muscles aching, their thoughts narrowed to survival. When storms passed, silence followed. The sea flattened. Wind faded. The ships drifted once more. These moments felt suspended, as if time itself slowed. Eventually, subtle changes appeared. The coastline fractured. Channels widened. The water shifted in color and movement. Tides behaved differently. Experienced sailors noticed these signs and spoke of them quietly. Something lay ahead. Magellan ordered caution. The fleet slowed. Boats were sent forward to scout. Depths were measured constantly. Land rose on either side, narrowing the sea. They had reached the threshold of something unknown. Not yet the passage, but its promise. The ships advanced carefully, their progress deliberate and tense. Behind them lay months of hardship. Ahead lay a narrow opening that might finally lead west, or end everything. The continent, after resisting them for so long, began to yield. The opening in the land did not resemble a gateway. It was narrow, uneven, and uncertain. Cliffs rose on either side, their surfaces dark and weathered. The water shifted constantly, pulled by tides that surged in opposing directions. Wind funneled through the passage, changing without warning. The fleet entered slowly. Sails were lowered when necessary. Oars were brought out to guide the ships through tighter sections. Anchors were dropped repeatedly to hold position against shifting currents. Progress was measured in careful distances rather than speed. The passage twisted. Channels divided and rejoined. Some narrowed until the ships barely fit between the rocky edges. Others widened into quiet basins where the water calmed briefly before accelerating again. The men watched constantly. Every sound mattered. The scrape of wood against stone was feared. Depth was checked repeatedly with lead lines. Orders were passed in low, controlled voices. One ship turned back. The San Antonio, the largest vessel in the fleet, separated during the passage. Its captain chose not to continue. He turned east and abandoned the expedition, taking with him valuable supplies. The loss was felt immediately. Fewer men remained. Less food remained. Less margin for error remained. Trust eroded further. Magellan pressed on. The passage continued for weeks. Storms blew through the narrow channels. Snow fell on the surrounding peaks. Fires were difficult to keep lit. Cold settled deep into the bones of the crew. Despite this, the water slowly changed. The tides eased. The current steadied. The air felt different. Experienced sailors sensed the shift before it was seen. Then, at last, the passage opened. The land fell away. The horizon widened. The sea ahead stretched outward without visible boundary. They had reached another ocean. Magellan named it the Pacific, believing it calmer than the waters they had known before. The name reflected hope more than certainty. The ships rested briefly. Repairs were made where possible. Ropes were tightened. Sails were inspected. The crews gathered what strength they could before departure. Beyond the passage lay vastness. No one aboard understood its scale. Maps offered no guidance. Estimates were hopeful but untested. The fleet turned west once more. The narrow waters closed behind them. The land that had resisted them for so long receded into distance. Ahead lay weeks or months of open sea. The men prepared themselves quietly. They adjusted sails, secured cargo, checked water and food, said their prayers. The Pacific received them without resistance. Its surface appeared smooth, almost gentle. The ships moved steadily forward. For a moment, the worst seemed behind them, but the ocean ahead would ask more than any sea they had known before. And it would take its time. At first, the Pacific seemed forgiving. The wind held steady. The waves rolled gently beneath the hulls. Days passed without storms, without the sharp violence the men had learned to expect. The ships moved smoothly, their sails full, their wake calm and narrow. This calm brought relief. It also brought something more difficult to endure. With no land in sight and no change on the horizon, days blended together. The sun rose and set with mechanical certainty. The stars traced the same slow paths each night. The ocean remained wide and empty in every direction. Routine deepened. Watches changed. Meals were served. Decks were cleaned. Sails were trimmed. The same actions repeated without variation. The predictability dulled the senses, and the absence of landmarks made distance feel unreal. Navigation became an act of faith. Longitude could not be measured. Progress was estimated by speed and time alone. Officers kept careful logs, though even they knew the numbers were approximations. The ships moved forward, but no one could say how far. Supplies diminished quietly. Hardtack grew harder. Meat grew saltier. The last of the dried vegetables was consumed. Fresh food became memory rather than expectation. Water turned foul. Casks leaked. Some water developed a green film. Vinegar was added, masking taste but not thirst. Each ration was smaller than the last. Drinking became deliberate, measured, restrained. The human body responded slowly. Gums softened. Teeth loosened. Old wounds reopened. Skin bruised easily. These signs were subtle at first, easily dismissed as fatigue or age. Sleep became restless. Without changes in environment, the mind wandered. Dreams grew vivid and disordered. Some men spoke aloud in their sleep. Others lay awake, listening to the ship breathe around them. The ships themselves aged visibly. Wood dried and cracked under constant sun. Pitch softened and ran. Canvas weakened. Ropes frayed. Repairs were attempted carefully, but materials were limited. Every fix was temporary. Hygiene was minimal. Saltwater rinses replaced washing. Clothes were worn until they stiffened with grime. Lice spread. Skin infections followed. These were accepted as part of life at sea. Rats became bolder. They moved freely below deck, feeding on crumbs and gnawing at leather. Some were trapped and eaten. Protein was protein. Few complained. The calm persisted. Weeks passed without storm or rain. The ocean remained deceptively gentle. The men began to understand that calm could be as dangerous as violence. Morale shifted again. There were no longer arguments, no open resentment. Fatigue softened conflict. Energy was conserved instinctively. Prayer increased. Some gathered together, others prayed alone. Faith became quieter, more personal. Words were repeated without urgency, as if spoken to pass time rather than seek miracles. Magellan remained resolute. He maintained discipline. He rationed supplies carefully. He said little, but his presence remained firm. The voyage continued because stopping was impossible. Occasionally, birds appeared. Their presence stirred brief excitement. Men watched the sky, hoping land might follow. But the birds vanished as quickly as they arrived, leaving the horizon unchanged. The Pacific stretched on. It offered no resistance. It offered no relief. And slowly, without announcement, the cost of crossing it began to surface more clearly. As the weeks on the Pacific extended beyond expectation, hunger became constant. It was no longer tied to mealtimes. It lived quietly in the body, a dull pressure that never fully faded. Men learned to ignore it during work, but it returned during still moments, especially at night. Food had lost all variety. Hardtack was reduced to fragments. What remained was often softened in water that smelled of wood and decay. Salted meat had long since turned unrecognizable. Its surface was scraped clean before boiling, and even then it resisted chewing. Leather became food. Straps, belts, and scraps of animal hide were soaked, scraped, and cooked until they softened enough to swallow. The process took hours. The result provided little nourishment, but it filled the mouth and slowed the ache. Rats were hunted deliberately. They were caught with traps or by hand. Their meat was divided carefully. Even this was rationed. Nothing edible was wasted. The body changed. Weight fell away. Faces grew hollow. Eyes sank deeper into their sockets. Clothing hung loosely. Movements slowed, conserving energy without conscious effort. Scurvy advanced. Gums swelled and bled. Teeth loosened. Some men lost teeth entirely. Wounds refused to heal. Bruises appeared without cause. Pain became constant, though rarely spoken aloud. Strength faded unevenly. Some men continued working through exhaustion. Others collapsed suddenly, unable to rise. These differences created quiet tension, but there was no anger left to express it. The ships felt heavier, not physically, but emotionally. Each death altered the balance. Bodies were sewn into cloth or canvas when possible. Prayers were spoken briefly. The dead were committed to the sea without ceremony. The ocean accepted them without response. Silence followed each loss. The living returned to their tasks with fewer words than before. Death became another element of the voyage, neither dramatic nor unexpected. Rain finally came. For a brief time, it brought relief. Mouths opened to the sky. Cloth was spread to collect fresh water. Barrels were refilled. The taste of rain felt almost foreign. But rain passed. The calm returned. The sun burned overhead. The ocean resumed its endless sameness. Navigation continued. Officers adjusted estimates. Distances grew uncertain. Maps offered no comfort. The world felt larger than anticipated, stretched beyond human measure. Men stopped asking how far remained. The question had no answer. Conversation diminished. Stories faded. Laughter disappeared. Even complaints felt like wasted energy. Silence became the dominant sound, broken only by wind, creaking wood, and the slow rhythm of the sea. At night, the stars remained. They were unchanged, steady, and distant. Some men took comfort in them, others avoided looking, overwhelmed by their indifference. The voyage continued not through optimism, but through inertia. Turning back was impossible. Stopping was meaningless. Only forward movement remained. The Pacific allowed it. Day after day, the ships advanced across its vast surface, carrying bodies that weakened and minds that learned to endure quietly. Land would come eventually. But for now, the ocean held them completely. When land finally appeared, it felt unreal. At first, it was only a suggestion, a low change in color where the sea met the sky. Men stared at it without speaking, unsure whether to trust their eyes. Hallucinations had become common. Hunger and exhaustion distorted perception. But the shape remained. Birds circled above it. The water shifted in tone. The smell of vegetation carried faintly on the wind. Guam lay ahead. The ships approached slowly, cautiously. Anchors were prepared. After months without solid ground, the act of lowering them felt deliberate and heavy, as if the sea itself resisted letting go. Boats were lowered. Men stepped ashore carefully, their legs unsteady after so long at sea. Others simply stood, unmoving, letting the land support their weight. Fresh water was found quickly. Streams ran clear. Men drank deeply at first, then were restrained by officers who feared illness. Water was collected and carried back to the ships. The taste alone lifted spirits. Food followed. Local inhabitants approached in small boats. They traded willingly at first, bringing fruit and fish. Fresh flesh, fresh plants, and clean water restored strength more quickly than expected. For a brief time, the expedition breathed again. Repairs began immediately. Ships were inspected thoroughly. Sails were patched. Ropes were replaced where possible. Hulls were scraped clean of growth. Fires burned freely. Smoke rose without concern for fuel. Men washed. Clothes were rinsed. Bodies were cleaned as well as circumstances allowed. Lice diminished. Skin infections eased. The simple act of washing felt restorative. But tension returned quickly. Some encounters with locals turned hostile. Theft occurred on both sides. Misunderstandings escalated. Magellan responded with force, ordering attacks meant to assert control. The calm broke. Skirmishes followed. Fear replaced relief. The fleet did not linger. They departed Guam with fresh supplies but little peace. Sailing onward, the ships reached the Philippine archipelago. The waters changed again. Islands dotted the horizon. Winds shifted unpredictably. Currents pulled in complex patterns. The men felt surrounded rather than exposed. Anchorage was found at Cebu. Here, Magellan pursued alliances. Local rulers were approached. Gifts were exchanged. Agreements were made. Conversion to Christianity was encouraged and, in some cases, accepted. Ceremonies were performed. For a moment, the expedition believed stability had been found. Food was plentiful. Fresh water was abundant. Men recovered strength. Discipline relaxed slightly. The long crossing seemed justified at last, but involvement brought risk. Magellan committed himself to local conflicts. He chose to intervene in disputes between island leaders, believing his authority and weapons would secure loyalty. This decision changed everything. The fleet prepared for confrontation on the island of Mactan. What followed would end Magellan's command and reshape the voyage entirely. The ships waited offshore. The men watched the shoreline in silence, unaware that the expedition had reached a turning point from which it would not return unchanged. The boats left the ships before dawn. The water was shallow near the shore, forcing the men to wade the final distance. Armor weighed heavily in the water. Weapons were held above the surface to keep them dry. The tide moved slowly, pulling against their legs. The island of Mactan was quiet. Palm trees stood still in the early light. The shoreline was uneven, scattered with rocks and coral that made footing uncertain. The men advanced carefully, slowed by equipment and unfamiliar terrain. Magellan led from the front. He believed the show of force would be enough. Firearms, steel, and discipline had carried authority elsewhere. He expected resistance to break quickly. It did not. Local warriors waited beyond the shoreline. They were lightly armed, but numerous. They knew the land. They moved freely across it. When the fighting began, it spread unevenly, fragmented by terrain and confusion. The muskets were slow to reload. Crossbows required space and stability. The water limited movement, shots were fired, but their effect was less than expected. The defenders advanced steadily, circling rather than charging. Magellan was struck first in the leg. He continued fighting, directing his men, attempting to hold formation. More blows followed. The water slowed retreat. Armor trapped him in place. He fell. The men nearby attempted to reach him but were driven back. The fighting became chaotic. Orders were lost in noise and movement. The retreat was called too late. Magellan was killed on the shore. His body was not recovered. Those who survived returned to the boats, wounded and shaken. The crossing back to the ships was silent. No victory had been gained. No authority had been secured. The expedition had lost its commander. On board, the impact was immediate. Leadership fractured. Officers argued over command. Decisions slowed. Confidence weakened. The certainty Magellan had imposed vanished with him. The alliances at Cebu collapsed quickly. Trust faded. Fear replaced cooperation. A feast offered by local leaders ended in betrayal. Several officers were killed during negotiations. The fleet withdrew. With fewer leaders and fewer men, choices became limited. One ship was deemed unusable and burned to redistribute its crew. Only 3 ships remained. The voyage continued under new command. Juan Sebastian Elcano would eventually guide the expedition home, but this was not yet clear. Authority passed between men uncertainly, shaped by necessity rather than design. The Spice Islands still lay ahead. Despite loss, despite exhaustion, the ships sailed on. Magellan's vision persisted without him, but the journey would now be defined by survival rather than ambition. The sea opened again before them, indifferent to what had been lost on the shore of Mactan. The days following Magellan's death were marked by uncertainty. No single voice replaced his authority immediately. Decisions were debated longer. Orders were questioned more often. The structure that had carried the expedition across 2 oceans weakened without collapsing entirely. The ships remained near Cebu only briefly. Trust had been broken. Supplies were gathered quickly. Anchors were raised without ceremony. The sails filled, and the fleet withdrew into open water, leaving behind both allies and enemies. Life aboard changed subtly. Discipline remained, but it was enforced unevenly. Some officers hesitated where Magellan would have acted without pause. Others asserted authority too forcefully, creating tension rather than cohesion. The remaining ships sailed southward through familiar-looking waters that offered little reassurance. Islands appeared and vanished. Currents shifted. The environment felt abundant compared to the Pacific, but the men were no longer capable of enjoying it fully. Loss weighed heavily. Food improved briefly. Fish were caught regularly. Fresh fruit and plants were traded when encounters allowed. Strength returned unevenly. Those most weakened recovered slowly, if at all. Repairs continued. Sails that had survived months of sun and wind were patched carefully. Ropes were replaced where possible. Woodwork was reinforced. Every ship bore visible signs of its long journey. Eventually, the expedition reached the Spice Islands. The purpose of the voyage resurfaced. Cloves were abundant. Their scent filled the air. Barrels were loaded carefully, packed tight with dried spice. The cargo justified the years of hardship, at least in the eyes of the Spanish crown. But danger remained. Portuguese presence was feared. Encounters were avoided. Decisions were made quickly. The fleet could not afford confrontation. Another ship was lost. Damage and decay made it impossible to continue. Its crew was redistributed. The vessel was abandoned, then destroyed to prevent capture. Only one ship remained fit for the long return. The Victoria. It was overloaded with spices and men. Its hull sat low in the water. Its sails were worn. Its crew was exhausted. A decision was made. Rather than return across the Pacific, which seemed unthinkable, the Victoria would continue west. Around Africa, through waters controlled by Portugal. The most dangerous route became the only option. Supplies were divided carefully. Every barrel mattered. Every rope was checked. Every man was needed. The ship departed quietly. No ceremony marked the beginning of the final leg. No speeches were given. The remaining crew understood the risk without explanation. The world lay behind and ahead at once. The Victoria turned into the open ocean once more, carrying with it the weight of everything already lost and everything still uncertain. The circumnavigation was not yet complete, but it had already claimed more than anyone aboard had imagined when the voyage began. The Victoria sailed west with no escort. The ocean felt different now, not because of its nature, but because of what remained aboard. Fewer voices filled the air. Fewer footsteps crossed the deck. Each sound carried farther than before. The ship was heavy. Barrels of clothes filled the hold, stacked carefully to avoid shifting in rough seas. The weight pressed the hull lower into the water. Every wave felt closer. Every creak of wood was listened to closely. Sails were adjusted constantly. Canvas weakened by years of exposure could tear without warning. Rips were stitched quickly. Ropes were replaced when possible, spliced when not. Nothing was wasted. Everything was reused. Food was rationed again. Fresh supplies vanished within weeks. Hardtack returned. Salted meat returned. Hunger returned, though never as severely as during the Pacific crossing. The memory of that suffering remained close. Water was guarded carefully. Rain was collected whenever possible. Casks were inspected daily. Vinegar was mixed sparingly. Thirst was managed with discipline rather than comfort. The Indian Ocean tested the ship relentlessly. Wind shifted violently. Storms rose without pattern. Waves struck from unexpected angles. The Victoria rolled heavily, her overloaded hull slow to respond. Men worked through exhaustion, hands bled, muscles failed. Still, sails were raised and lowered. Pumps were worked day and night. Water intrusion was constant but manageable. Disease returned. Scurvy never fully left. Weakness lingered. Some men could no longer climb rigging. Others struggled to stand watch. Every loss now felt heavier. Portuguese ships were avoided. Courses were altered. Lights were extinguished at night. Silence was maintained whenever unfamiliar sails appeared on the horizon. Capture would mean imprisonment or worse. The Cape of Good Hope lay ahead. Its reputation preceded it. Winds there were fierce. Currents collided. Many ships were lost in those waters. The Victoria approached it cautiously, hugging distance when possible. Storms battered the ship relentlessly. Sails were shredded and repaired repeatedly. Men were thrown against rails. Sleep became impossible. Cold returned. Rain soaked everything. When the Cape was finally passed, relief was brief. The journey north along Africa was no kinder. Supplies dwindled further. Strength faded again. Every day became an exercise in restraint. Eventually, Cape Verde appeared. The crew stopped only briefly, disguising their purpose and origin. Supplies were taken in secret. The risk was enormous. Some men were captured when the truth emerged. The Victoria fled. Fewer than 20 men remained aboard. The ship sailed on. Europe lay somewhere ahead, still distant, still uncertain. The ocean continued to demand patience, effort, and quiet endurance. The circumnavigation was close, but the cost was not yet fully paid. The final weeks at sea unfolded slowly. The Victoria moved northward with caution, her crew reduced to a small number of exhausted men who knew each other's movements by habit alone. There was little conversation left. Words had lost their usefulness. Everything necessary was communicated through gesture, glance, and routine. The ship carried the marks of its passage. The hull bore stains from salt and pitch. Repairs layered upon repairs were visible along the seams. The sails were patchwork now, stitched from remnants gathered over years. Nothing matched. Nothing was whole. Yet the ship held. Each morning began the same way. Those able to rise did so carefully. Muscles protested. Joints resisted. Men leaned against the rail, waiting for balance to return. The sea stretched outward, calmer now, but no less vast. Food was nearly gone. Rations were measured with care that bordered on ritual. Hardtack crumbs were divided evenly. A mouthful of water was taken slowly. Eating became an act of respect rather than satisfaction. The body adapted to scarcity. Movement slowed. Energy was conserved instinctively. No one hurried. No one wasted effort. The mind focused on immediate tasks, leaving little space for fear or anticipation. Navigation continued. The sun was observed daily. Notes were made. Bearings were checked. The familiarity of these actions brought a strange comfort. They had been repeated thousands of times before. At night, the stars remained unchanged. They were the same stars seen leaving Spain, the same ones watched during the Pacific crossing, the same ones that had looked down on the shore at Matan. Their presence marked continuity where nothing else had remained constant. Illness lingered. Some men could no longer work. They were cared for quietly. There were no speeches, no reassurances. Comfort was offered through presence rather than words. The ocean softened as Europe approached. Winds steadied. Temperatures moderated. The water changed color. These signs were noticed but not celebrated. Experience had taught restraint. Land appeared gradually. At first, it was only suggestion, a subtle shift in air, a faint line where the horizon changed. Then it became undeniable. Spain lay ahead. The ship approached slowly, as if unwilling to believe its own course. Anchors were prepared. Sails were eased. The river mouth opened before them. On the 6th day of September, in the year 1522, the Victoria entered Sanlúcar de Barrameda. The return was quiet. There were no crowds waiting. No music. The ship slipped into harbor with little notice. Only 18 men stood aboard. They were thin, weathered, altered by time and distance. They had circled the world. The journey that began with 5 ships and hundreds of men ended with 1 vessel and a handful of survivors. The cargo of spices was unloaded carefully. Accounts were taken. Names were recorded. The world had been measured differently now. Not fully understood. Not conquered. But connected. The sea released them at last, and the ship, having carried them farther than any before it, came to rest, her work complete. After the Victoria was secured in harbor, there was a period of stillness. The ship no longer moved beneath the men's feet. The constant motion that had shaped their bodies and thoughts for years was suddenly absent. Some found this unsettling. Balance felt uncertain on solid ground. Sleep came unevenly, interrupted by the memory of waves and wind. The survivors remained close to the ship at first. They moved slowly along the dock, touching the rail, the rigging, the patched sails. The Victoria had become familiar in a way no place on land could be. She had carried them through distances that had once seemed impossible. Officials arrived gradually. Questions were asked. Logs were examined. Cargo was measured and recorded. The weight of cloves alone justified the voyage in financial terms, though nothing could account for its human cost. The men were summoned one by one. They spoke of storms, hunger, mutiny, illness, and loss. They described places few in Europe had seen. Their words were careful, shaped by fatigue rather than pride. Recognition followed. Juan Sebastian Elcano was honored for completing the circumnavigation. Titles were granted. Rewards were promised. But for many of the crew, acknowledgement mattered less than rest. Some returned to families. Reunions were quiet. Years had passed. Children had grown. Parents had aged. Some homes stood unchanged. Others no longer existed. Loss was discovered even on land. Others had no one waiting. They found lodging near the port. They took small work. They carried the sea with them in posture and habit. They woke early. They listened for sounds that were no longer there. The ship was inspected thoroughly. Its condition surprised many. That it had survived at all seemed remarkable. Repairs were noted. Modifications were studied. The vessel became proof rather than myth. Time passed. The expedition entered records and chronicles. Its meaning was debated. Its risks were discussed. Its achievements were measured. The world had been circled. This fact altered maps and understanding. Oceans were placed in proportion. Distances gained scale. The Pacific was no longer imagined as narrow. The earth itself felt larger and more complex. Yet the sea remained unchanged. It did not mark the event. It did not respond. Waves continued to rise and fall as they always had. The names of the lost faded slowly. Some were remembered in logs, others only in memory. Most left no trace beyond the distance they traveled. The Victoria stayed in harbor. Its sails were lowered. Its rigging loosened. The ship rested, carrying the quiet weight of everything it had endured. And as the years passed, the voyage became something different. less a story of ambition, more a record of endurance. The sea had allowed passage, at great cost, and it asked nothing in return. As weeks turned into months, the expedition settled into history. Not all at once, not cleanly. The voyage did not conclude with celebration alone. It ended in layers, slowly, as its meaning spread beyond the dock where the Victoria rested. The ship itself became an object of attention. Sailors from other ports came to see it. They examined the patched sails and worn timbers. They traced the lines of repair where damage had been answered with patience rather than replacement. The Victoria was smaller than many expected. It carried no grandeur. Its strength lay in endurance, not design. Accounts were copied carefully. Logs were transcribed by hand. Distances were debated. Dates were compared. Some inconsistencies appeared, the result of exhaustion, imperfect instruments, and the slow drift of timekeeping across oceans. A strange discovery followed. The men realized they had lost a day. By sailing westward around the world, they had experienced one fewer sunrise than those who remained in Europe. This confusion unsettled scholars and priests alike. It forced a reconsideration of time itself, of how the world moved beneath the sun. The expedition reshaped understanding quietly. Maps were redrawn. Oceans expanded. Continents shifted in proportion. The Pacific, once imagined narrow and manageable, now stretched impossibly wide across parchment. Future voyages would not begin with innocence. The knowledge gained came at the cost of certainty. Sailors now understood how small ships truly were against the scale of the planet, how supplies could vanish faster than expected, how survival depended on restraint rather than courage alone. Stories spread unevenly. Some emphasized heroism. Others spoke of suffering. Many left out the names of those who did not return. History preferred clarity. The voyage itself had been anything but clear. The families of the lost received little. Some were informed officially. Others learned through rumor or silence. Years passed without confirmation. Closure was rare. The survivors carried invisible marks. They walked differently. They slept lightly. Loud storms startled them even on land. The sea had reshaped them in ways no record could capture. The Spice Islands trade continued. Spain claimed success. Portugal contested boundaries. Treaties shifted. The world moved forward, driven by commerce rather than reflection. Yet beneath these changes, something deeper had occurred. The earth was no longer abstract. It had been felt through hunger, cold, and distance. Its oceans had been crossed not by certainty, but by persistence. The edges of maps had been touched and found to be real. The Victoria was eventually dismantled. Its wood returned to use. Its iron was repurposed. Nothing remained intact. Ships were never meant to last. Only their journeys endured, and so the expedition faded. Not into legend alone, but into understanding. It became proof that the world could be circled, and a reminder that doing so demanded more than ambition. It demanded time, endurance, and the quiet willingness to continue when turning back was no longer possible. Long after the Victoria was taken apart and her timbers reused, the sea remained unchanged. The routes traced by the expedition did not leave visible marks on the water. No line remained to show where the ships had passed. Waves continued their motion without memory. Tides rose and fell as they always had. Yet the voyage altered how the sea was approached. Sailors who followed did so with greater caution. They carried more provisions. They planned for longer distances. They spoke more openly of hunger, disease, and loss. The illusion of easy passage had been broken. Ship life, once accepted without question, was reconsidered. Designs changed slowly. Holds were reorganized. Ventilation improved in small ways. Freshwater storage became a greater priority. These changes came not from theory, but from suffering recorded in logbooks and memory. The ocean itself became something measured. Its scale was no longer guessed at from shore. It was counted in weeks without land, in barrels emptied, in bodies weakened. The Pacific was now understood as a vast separation rather than a bridge. Those who survived the circumnavigation rarely spoke of it at length. When they did, they focused on simple details: the sound of wind in rigging, the taste of rain after drought, the weight of silence during long crossings. These were the things that stayed with them. The dead were remembered unevenly. Some names appeared in records. Others disappeared entirely. Many had no graves, no markers, no witnesses beyond the sea itself. Their absence became part of the voyage's cost. On land, time continued. Markets reopened. Ships departed for familiar routes. Politics shifted. New conflicts arose. The circumnavigation became one event among many, remarkable but distant. Yet its influence remained beneath the surface. It shaped expectations. It redefined distance. It altered how humanity understood its place on the planet. The world felt larger, but also more connected. The sea had allowed passage around the earth, but it had not offered mercy. It had demanded endurance, patience, and acceptance of loss. Those lessons lingered quietly. They passed from sailor to sailor, from captain to apprentice, not always spoken, but understood. And so the expedition endured not as a single story, but as a shared awareness. That the world could be crossed, and that doing so required more than courage. It required time, restraint, and the willingness to move forward, even when nothing lay ahead but open water. For those who had sailed on the expedition, distance never felt abstract again. They had lived inside it. They had counted it not in miles, but in meals missed, in sails repaired too many times, in men lost quietly to illness or exhaustion. Distance had become something physical, something carried in the body. When these men spoke to others who dreamed of the sea, they rarely discouraged them. They simply described it. They spoke of how days at sea did not pass evenly, how some stretched endlessly while others vanished without memory, how the mind learned to narrow its focus, attending only to what could be controlled. They described the way ships aged, wood softened, iron weakened, canvas lost its strength. Everything required attention. Nothing remained stable without effort. Even stillness demanded work. They spoke of food, of how taste changed when hunger became constant, how bitterness and salt no longer mattered, how the body learned to accept what was available without protest. They spoke of sleep, how it came in fragments, how dreams blended with waking thoughts, how the motion of the sea followed them long after the voyage ended, rocking them gently even on solid ground. The sea had reshaped their sense of time. 3 years had passed, yet it felt both brief and endless. Memory condensed suffering while stretching calm moments thin. The voyage resisted summary. Maps improved after the expedition. Lines became more accurate. Distances expanded. Blank spaces shrank, but the knowledge behind those lines remained incomplete. The sea could be crossed, yes, but not mastered. Each future voyage carried echoes of the first circumnavigation, not in ambition alone, but in caution, in preparation, in acceptance that plans would fail and adaptation would be necessary. The expedition had not conquered the world, it had revealed it. And in doing so, it reminded those who followed that survival at sea depended less on dominance than on patience. The ocean did not reward force. it tolerated persistence. That understanding settled slowly into maritime culture, shaping generations who would never know the names of every man lost, but would inherit the lessons paid for by them. The world had been circled, and the sea remained what it had always been, vast and different and enduring. With time, the voyage ceased to feel immediate. Years passed. New ships were built. New expeditions departed. The circumnavigation of the globe became a reference point rather than a living memory, cited in records and discussions rather than felt in the body. Yet for those who had not sailed, the world now carried a subtle shift. Distance was spoken of differently. Oceans were no longer imagined as narrow barriers, but as vast spaces requiring preparation and restraint. The Pacific, in particular, entered the European imagination as something immense and unforgiving. Seafaring knowledge spread quietly. Techniques refined during the expedition were absorbed into practice. Rationing became more deliberate. Attention to hull maintenance increased. Captains learned to plan for failure as much as success. Ship life remained harsh. Men still slept close together. Food still spoiled. Disease still followed long voyages. But expectations had changed. The suffering was no longer unexpected. It was anticipated, accounted for, and endured with fewer illusions. The names of places remained. The Strait of Magellan appeared on maps, a narrow line connecting two oceans. It became a route known for danger rather than promise. Few sought it willingly. Those who did approached it with caution and respect. Magellan himself became a figure of contradiction. He was remembered as visionary and commander, but also as rigid and unyielding. His death on a distant shore became part of the story's weight, a reminder that authority did not guarantee survival. Juan Sebastian Elcano's name endured more quietly. He was the one who brought the ship home. He carried the final responsibility. His role was less dramatic but essential. The completion of the voyage rested on his restraint and persistence. The sea reclaimed its role. It did not become familiar. It did not grow smaller. But it was no longer entirely unknown. Knowledge expanded, while mystery remained. For sailors setting out on new voyages, the circumnavigation offered reassurance and warning at once. The world could be crossed, but it demanded time, endurance, and acceptance of loss. As generations followed, the expedition settled into the background of history, its details softened by distance. What remained was not triumph, but understanding. The earth was larger than imagined, and crossing it required more than ambition. It required the quiet willingness to continue even when nothing lay ahead but open water, and no promise waited beyond the horizon. As decades passed, the voyage became part of inherited knowledge rather than lived experience. Children learned of it from maps and lessons. Scholars debated its meaning. Sailors referenced it when speaking of long passages and uncertain returns. The expedition lived on through repetition, though fewer remembered its texture. The sea itself did not change. It continued to test ships and men with the same indifference it always had. Storms rose without regard for history. Calm stretched endlessly across the horizon. The ocean offered neither reward nor punishment. It simply existed. What endured were practices. Sailors learned to conserve rather than consume. They learned to observe weather with patience. They learned that ships required constant attention, not occasional repair. These habits were passed quietly from one crew to the next. Life aboard remained simple and confined. Men still slept in shared spaces. They still ate what could be preserved. Fresh food was still a rare luxury. Clean water remained precious. The lessons of the circumnavigation reinforced these realities rather than altering them. Time at sea continued to reshape those who lived it. Long voyages narrowed thought. They simplified priorities. Many sailors found it difficult to return fully to life on land. Stillness felt unnatural. Silence felt incomplete. The expedition had shown that the world could be measured by water, that continents could be approached from unexpected directions, that time itself could shift depending on the path taken. These ideas filtered slowly into broader understanding. Maps improved. Navigation became more reliable. Instruments were refined. Knowledge accumulated. Yet uncertainty remained at the heart of seafaring. Technology softened risk, but never erased it. The memory of loss persisted quietly. The names of the dead were rarely spoken aloud, but their absence shaped caution. Each future voyage carried the unspoken knowledge of what could be taken without warning. The circumnavigation did not inspire recklessness. It encouraged respect. Respect for distance. Respect for preparation. Respect for the sea's scale and endurance. In this way, the expedition continued to influence the world long after the ships themselves were gone. Not through spectacle, but through restraint, through understanding, and through the quiet acceptance that the sea would always remain larger than those who crossed it. Long after the last survivor of the voyage had died, the ocean continued to instruct those who ventured upon it, not through words but through repetition. Each long crossing reinforced the same lessons learned aboard the Victoria. Supplies vanished faster than expected. Weather defied prediction. Human strength proved limited. Ships demanded constant care, and neglect was punished without delay. Sailors adapted gradually. They learned to listen to the sea rather than challenge it. They learned that forcing progress often led to loss, while patience preserved both ship and crew. These lessons did not come from theory, but from observation passed quietly between generations. Life at sea remained demanding. Men still rose before dawn. They still worked with salt-stiffened hands. They still slept in shared spaces, close enough to feel each other's breathing. Comfort remained rare. Endurance remained essential. Food continued to shape morale. A fresh meal lifted spirits more than any speech. Clean water restored strength more effectively than rest. These truths, so clear during the circumnavigation, became foundational knowledge for sailors everywhere. The circumnavigation itself took on symbolic weight. It represented not conquest, but continuity, a demonstration that the earth was not fragmented, but connected. That movement across its surface required cooperation with forces larger than human intention. Magellan's name endured, often simplified. He became associated with ambition and discovery, while the complexity of the voyage faded. The mutinies, the starvation, the compromises were mentioned less frequently. History preferred clear narratives. Yet, among sailors, the fuller story persisted. They spoke of the Pacific crossing as a warning. They spoke of the strait with caution. They remembered the cost paid by those who went first. The sea preserved these memories differently than books. It reminded through experience, through repetition, through the unchanging nature of its demands. Every horizon remained distant. Every crossing required preparation. Every voyage carried uncertainty. The circumnavigation did not close the world. It revealed it as something vast, interconnected, and resistant to control. And so the ocean continued, patient and unmoved, offering passage only to those willing to accept its terms. Those terms had not changed. They never would. Eventually, even the movement of ships became memory. The sounds of rigging, the strain of canvas, the creak of wood under shifting weight. These faded from daily life and remained only in recollection. For those who had sailed, these sounds sometimes returned in quiet moments, uninvited, as faint echoes of another rhythm. The expedition lived on in fragments, a line in a logbook, a corrected map, a coastal name spoken without explanation. Each fragment hinted at a journey larger than itself, one that could not be fully contained in words or drawings. On land, the world continued its routines. Ships departed for known routes, markets opened and closed, politics shifted with familiar patterns. The circumnavigation did not interrupt daily life for most. It altered understanding rather than habit. Yet understanding has weight. The idea that the earth could be encircled by sea changed how distance was imagined. Oceans were no longer edges. They were connections, demanding respect rather than conquest. Sailors carried this quietly. They prepared more carefully. They spoke less confidently of unknown waters. They accepted uncertainty as part of the voyage rather than a flaw in planning. Life at sea remained constrained. Men still lived close together. Privacy remained rare. Food remained preserved and limited. The lessons of scarcity learned during the expedition did not fade. They became expectation. The ships themselves reflected this knowledge. Designs adjusted slowly. Storage was reconsidered. Ventilation improved in small ways. No innovation removed hardship entirely, but each reduced its sharpest edges. The ocean observed without response. It did not recognize progress or regret. It continued to move with the same indifference it always had. Those who crossed it adapted. Those who did not remained unaware of its scale. Memory softened the voyage. Suffering became less immediate. Loss became abstract. What remained was endurance, the fact that the journey had been completed at all. The world settled into its expanded shape. Maps no longer felt tentative. Oceans occupied their proper space. Continents aligned differently in the mind. The circumnavigation had not mastered the sea. It had simply passed through it. And in doing so, it had changed how humanity understood both distance and limitation. The ocean remained. Motion became memory. And the horizon continued to wait. Long after the last ripples of the expedition's passage disappeared, the sea returned to its familiar patterns. Currents moved as they always had. Winds followed seasonal paths. Storms rose and fell without regard for history. The water did not remember the ships that crossed it, nor the men who struggled upon its surface. What remained existed elsewhere. In the habits of sailors who packed more provisions than before. In captains who listened more carefully to changing weather. In quiet decisions made at sea, shaped by lessons learned far from shore. The circumnavigation left no monuments on the water. There were no markers to show where hunger had been endured, where storms had threatened to end everything, where men had been lost quietly to illness or exhaustion. Those moments dissolved into the motion of the sea. On land, memory took a different form. The voyage was written into chronicles. It appeared in libraries and royal records. Dates and names were preserved. Routes were traced. These records gave structure to something that had once been uncertain and fragile. Yet the lived experience resisted capture. No account could fully describe the feeling of endless horizon. No drawing could convey the sound of a ship under strain at night. No map could express the slow erosion of strength during long weeks without land. The men who survived understood this. They carried the knowledge quietly. Some returned to the sea. Others stayed ashore. But none approached distance the same way again. Time softened the edges. What had once been fear became caution. What had been suffering became preparation. The ocean was no longer imagined as something to overcome, but something to move with. The circumnavigation did not end exploration. It refined it. It taught restraint. It encouraged patience. It reminded those who followed that endurance mattered more than speed, and adaptation more than force. The sea accepted all who came after under the same conditions. Nothing had changed for it, only for those who ventured across its surface. The wake faded, the water closed, and the ocean continued vast and unmoved, offering passage only to those willing to respect its scale and silence. In the end, the voyage returned to stillness. Not the sudden stillness of anchoring after a storm, nor the uneasy stillness of calm seas, but a deeper quiet. The kind that settles when effort is no longer required, when movement gives way to rest. The world did not feel smaller after the circumnavigation. It felt clearer. Oceans were no longer imagined as empty gaps between lands. They were understood as vast spaces with their own rhythms, their own demands. Crossing them was no longer a matter of bravery alone, but of preparation, patience, and time. The expedition had revealed limits, not just the limits of ships and supplies, but of the human body and mind. Hunger reshaped priorities. Fatigue narrowed focus. Distance altered perception. These changes were not temporary. They remained long after the voyage ended. The sea had not been conquered. It had been endured. That distinction mattered. Ships would continue to sail. Routes would multiply. Knowledge would expand. But the fundamental relationship between humans and the ocean remained unchanged. The sea allowed passage when conditions aligned. It withdrew it without explanation when they did not. What remained of the expedition existed quietly, in corrected maps, in revised expectations, in the understanding that the earth was continuous but never easy. The men who began the voyage had departed into uncertainty. Those who returned carried understanding instead of answers. They had seen the world not from above but from within it. From decks soaked with salt, from holds heavy with cargo, from days measured by survival rather than ambition. The ocean had shaped the journey from beginning to end. It shaped the pace. It shaped the losses. It shaped what endured. When the ships finally rested, when the sails were lowered and the rigging loosened, the sea did not pause. It continued its motion. Waves rose and fell. Currents shifted. Horizons waited. The world turned, complete and connected, vast and patient. And far from shore, the ocean remained exactly as it had always been. Quiet, endless, at rest.